Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to this edition of Get Quick, Get Sick with your host, Cryptochronica, where I teach you to get sick quickly. Today, we're going to begin our deep dive and deep exploration of drum sequencing and iterative sequencing as far as it pertains to drums. So we're going to talk about beats, beat structure, how to make your drums work, have a lot of movement. And in this series, we're going to look at everything from fills to builds to breakdowns to polyrhythms, grooves, spacing, stereo imagery, stereo width, and general movement as it goes. We're going to talk a lot about grooves and making sure that your drums are groovy right away. Because if you are not doing this motion, boom, 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 if you're not doing that right away, if you're not already sort of feeling the swing to your beats, then no matter what else you layer on top of them is just going to be lipstick on a pig. So I want to help you develop beats that instantly have that kind of swag that makes the whole track worth completing. We're in this for dance music. We want to make bodies move, and there are certain formulas that we can follow to achieve that end, and we're going to talk about some of those formulas today. So without further ado, we're going to start drum sequencing, and we're going to talk today in this lesson about iterative sequencing and what that means and how to get a lot out of your drum phrases so that there's a certain internal grammar amongst the drums themselves, almost as if each bar says a letter and then another bar kind of responds back to that letter, and you're going to form words with your phrasing. This is the key to all dance music, and once you start doing this process, not just iterative sequencing, but phrasing with every single component of your track, starting with the kick and the snare, and then marrying that to your sub, and then marrying that to your rhythm section, and then marrying those to your chords, and then your leads to your chords. What you get are these tracks that really make a lot of sense. They're predictable in unpredictable ways, and they talk to each other in a way that's coherent and groovy. So it's always good to learn iterative sequencing. And that's what we're going to start with. I have a new Ableton project up here, haven't saved it, haven't named it or anything. The one thing that I have done is I have 128s in each of these MIDI tracks already kind of color-coded and labeled. And I'm doing this right away because just a couple extra seconds in the beginning, spending on color-coding things and grouping the name, or on naming the groups, and getting them in the families of the instruments that they are will save you a ton of work later in the mixdown process. And you might also see me refer occasionally over to the session view and look down here at our volumes going out of the master channel so that I can just get a quick balance between all our drums. We want there to be, we don't want to hurt anybody's ears with really loud hi-hats and crashes. So I'm going to check down there periodically. If you see me press tab and come to this view, this is the only place that my eyes are going. They're looking immediately at the volume coming out of the master channel. And I'm going to do a very quick level, which is basically volume balance between the drum tracks. I'm going to do a whole other session on mixing and on leveling, so don't worry about that now. Just kind of trust me to know where the levels are supposed to be. Okay, so I've got a track at 140 BPM, some kicks, snares, hats, crashes, blah, 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 just a bunch of shit in here that isn't doing anything. So I'm going to start with iterative sequencing, and iterative sequencing is basically a principle where you start with a, if you start with like a, 2-bar phrase, all you have to do is duplicate it over and change one component. And that's going to be how we approach this beat. Now, the beat and the BPM are the defining characteristic of that song. If we're doing something at 128 BPM with a kick landing on every single beat of the phrase of the bar, like so, we're going to have a house track, whether we like it or not. This at 128 BPM is the foundation for a house track. And breakbeat music, so house music is a family of on-beat music, and that would be music that's 4 to the floor in every case. So a lot of funk is like 107 BPM on-beat music. House would be like 112, a really slow house, to like 128, 130. At 138, it goes scats, and it starts to become techno. Faster than that, you get all kinds of really cool combinations, and eventually you come to trance. Now, breakbeat music is where the kick and the snare do not land on the same beats of the bar. So that's like boom, cat, ba boom, boom, cat, boom, ka, ba-boom, boom, ka. They're taking turns in different places. I'll do a whole series on house music, but today we're going to stick with break music because breakbeat music is, in my opinion, it's got a lot more swing if you can do it right. Not to diss house, a lot of house is really swung as well, but not so much on the kick. The kick in house is one of the few things that's pretty much always on the grid, and then you'll like move the snares forward and swing the shit out of the hi-hats and the cymbals and stuff like that. But again, we'll save that for house. Today we're going to talk about breakbeat music. Now, 140 to like 164 would be the tempo for dubstep, and a bunch of other like really quick bass heavy sort of genres. And those are really cool. If you listen to Bass Nectar, as I'm sure most of you do, you will get a lot of exposure to that BPM range. Now, dubstep is an incredible invention because as far as a beat structure goes, it's technically a half beat, a half-time beat over a pretty quick tempo. So like 140 is pretty quick. And if I were going to make a beat doing that, let me find a nice snare here. Let's see what we got. Oh, that sucks. G's chill. Yeah, G's chill. Okay, cool. So if I was going to do a tempo kind of like this at 140, it would be really quick. That's pretty quick. There's a ton of actual kick in the snare that I don't want. Let's do that. That's a little bit, leaves us some room for some stuff that we're going to talk about later in the series where we talk about snare and kick layering to get the most out of your samples. All right, so if I had this beat structure, this is pretty quick, and if this was sped up to 164, it would be basically very slow drum and bass. So dubstep is incredible because it's taking these quick BPMs and it actually slows them down so that they're half beats. So it's closer to something at 70 BPM, and I'll show you exactly what that looks like. So if this was like so, this is an 140 BPM beat at the regular BPM. Cool, sweet. Now, if that was at 70 BPM, which was halftime, this would be the essence of dubstep. Yeah, et cetera, et cetera. So we don't want that. We're going to just actually build our drums so that they're halftime. And what that means is instead of having your snare land on the second beat and the fourth beat like so, it would actually be landing on the third beat, much like reggae, although reggae is a much slower BPM. This is what makes these things work. So the drums feel really slow and they feel really huge and they occupy a huge space of time, but there's still a ton of space in between the kick and the snare for those basses to get going really fast and be really textured and have a lot of movement and occupy a lot of the frequency spectrum from here to here. You have nearly, you have 2 beats of the whole bar to do it. So without further ado, I'm going to talk about iterative sequencing. So iterative sequencing is whenever you have basically like a bar of music or 2 bars of music, and all you do is you copy it over and change one thing. So if this is one iteration, boom, ka, I would copy this over and I would change one thing between the kick and the snare. So in this case, my big change is that. That's it. That's the only thing I'm going to do. Now, keeping with iterative sequencing, I'm going to consolidate and move it over and just change one thing about this copied over parcel. And in that case, what I'm going to do is this. This will be my big change. Woohoo, getting fucking risky here. And let's copy it over and change one thing. Sweet. So now we have moved it over one more time. Let's do that. And let's not do this. Let's do this instead. Cool. So I did 2 changes that time, but essentially you're following the same principle with iterative sequencing, where you make your phrase, you duplicate it over, and you change 1 or 2 things about the new segment. So now we have this. Cool. So each of these things has its own slightly different character. And when we start to follow this with every single component of our drum track, we're going to get these really interesting parcels of the music, like in here, all of those things, because they have been copied over. This bar will speak to this bar, and then it will refer back to this bar. And then this whole thing is going to be talking to this in a really coherent phrase structure. And that is the essence of all of this. So let's start with some hats. I'm going to look down here, and I see that this is the 8th bar division. So if I do this, I know that I have 8 bars of hats. I'm sorry, I have 8th note hats. Hat, 8th notes. There we go. Cool. I don't like that hat. I'm going to find something different. That's perfect. And if I've got this as bar, or is my first segment, I'm going to go all the way out. So this was the first thing that I'd copied over. I'm going to do the same thing here, and I'm going to duplicate that over and change one thing. Now, what I like to change about my hats is velocity, as opposed to the actual place that the hat is coming in. So what velocity is these little hit volume levels within the MIDI track itself. Let me make sure my velocity is on. So I went to my hats thing. I'm looking at my sampler, and I'm going to go to this part under Filter Global and make sure that my velocity to volume is actually affected. 100% is going to be really extreme. I like 35 to 50%. I'm going to do 35 in this case. So what that means is velocity will affect the way these drums are, how loudly the sampler plays them back. So this first one, which is all the way volume, is going to be a lot louder than these other ones. Chill. Now, the reason I'm emphasizing hat 1, is because if you visualize the way a drummer plays, a drummer is not able to make the same velocity hit happen over and over and over again. That's robotic and artificial in a way that the human ear finds distinctly unpleasant. For instance, that sounds like a beat machine that's fucking up, honestly. Now, if you visualize the way a drummer plays, they, in rock music at least, they go tick, 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 tick. You hear that first tick is a little bit louder. That's where their impulse is. And impulses in drums are what give drum players a very, very distinct style. If you take Danny Carey's drumming in a stem form, or the guy from Red Hot Chili Peppers, and you copy that into a DAW, and you see where all of his drum heads are lining up on the grid and the volume with which they're hitting, you'll see that it's all over the place, and that sometimes his snares are slow, and sometimes his snares are fast, and sometimes his snares are doing really low hits or loud hits, and that's because that has all kinds of natural human imperfections. And those imperfections are what give a drummer and a drum set its aesthetic, its subtleties, its nuances, its vibe. So as producers, it's constantly our challenge to trick the computer into recreating human imperfection and human impurities, human flaws, which give drums a natural sort of swing, a natural sort of swag, and a natural sort of vibe. So in this case, what I've done is I'm putting my impulse on the first downbeat. Now you can have an impulse, different genres use it in different places, but I know kind of where this drum beat is going to go, and I want this to be a sort of bass nectar-y, fast-paced, heavy-hitting track that's still dancey and still feels natural. So I'm going to put my impulse, like a rock musician, on my first downbeat, and these other ones are going to be a little bit quieter. This one I'm going to have up just a little bit, just so it has a little flavor. And now, because this is still all my very first iteration, hence the term iterative sequencing, I'm going to make sure it's the same. Now, when I duplicate this across, what I'm going to change isn't a position. I'm not going to take some shit out. What I'm going to actually do is I'm going to change the velocity ever so slightly so that there is an impulse, a bigger impulse here, and a bigger impulse here, and a bigger impulse there. So that's a big one. So that's what I'm doing in this case. Now I'm going to consolidate it, duplicate it, and change one thing. Now with this second one, what I'm feeling like I want to change is a rhythmic component. I want to make this ever so slightly faster in certain places, and I want to do this tastefully. So maybe I'll have a couple of 16th notes, and the way you can tell is when your grid is lined up like this, each of these bars, you can refer down here, is a 16th note. So if I press Command 1, now each of these little bars is a 32nd note. So 32nd notes, 8th notes, and 16th notes are the natural sort of drummer rhythmic grid divisions. People do not play at 64th fucking notes. If they do, they are like the guy from Block Party who just hits so fast that it sounds fake. Here's that. Yeah, nobody plays that fast, but that's used all the time, especially in awesome genres like trap, bass music. And we're going to explore all that stuff in a little bit. And quarter notes tends not to work at half beat times at 140 because it sounds really slow and like your drummer is unsure of himself. So I like to stick with eighth notes, 16th notes, and 32nd notes. And in this case, we're going to have just a couple of 16th notes right here before the snare. And I will do that right there too. So there's our second iteration. Now I'm going to consolidate, duplicate it across, and change one thing. Now, what should I change about this? It is important in drum phrases for the drums to constantly be escalating in intensity and in energy. Because if you have a drop fucking land, and you let the cat out of the bag right away, and you reveal everything the drop is going to have in that first space right here. If every perk is there, if every bass is there, if every vocal chop is there, what's going to happen is that by the time the listener gets to hear in the song, all of this will have revealed everything that you're going to expose later on in the drop. So it's nice to keep the cat in the bag and slowly let it out bit by bit so that we're constantly stimulating and generating interest and excitement. And one great way to do that is to escalate intensity and escalate energy. Now, what sound theorists and physicists believe energy in sound is quantifiable, and it's really interesting. So you can have just a kick and a snare and like a single quarter note hi-hat, just like boom, 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 with a huge 808 bass. Boom! And it doesn't matter how loud that 808 bass gets. If that drum beat doesn't speed up, it will never feel like it's overwhelming in its intensity. And that's because sound physicists have modeled energy as the frequency of the higher frequency instruments. So when you have a lot of hats happening, which are higher frequency instruments as opposed to something like a kick, it occupies mostly low frequencies. When you have a lot of higher frequencies being really busy, when you have that kind of thing happening, it feels exciting, energetic, and fast. So we've duplicated this sequence over, and in an effort to feel like this bar, or these 4 bars are going to escalate in energy, I want to speed this up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in a bunch of 16th notes. How predictable, how easy. And I will, no, that works fine. So I'm going to duplicate that over, duplicate that over, duplicate that over. Cool, let's just come over all the way. And I should keep with iterative sequencing. So let me duplicate that over and change one thing about that. In this case, I'll put in some 64th notes because we were talking about that. Or 32nd notes. Let's have 32nd notes happen before my snare. I know my snare is here. So let's find that, which is right over here. So I'm going to put in some 32nd notes there. Boom. Easy as that. And I will actually have it like that. So it goes up, ramps up. So the way I'm making that ramp is I'm holding command and I'm dragging the line all the way around in this bottom area. So that's how I ramped up that little thing. And of course, I'm not in front of the snare where I need to be. That's supposed to be there because it's down, because it's a half beat. It's confusing me. It's confusing my poor, weak eyes. All right, we'll just do that for some Flavor Flav. But this one is actually before the snare itself. Duplicate that over, and then I can duplicate the whole thing over and change one thing. I hope that's clear to everybody, why and how I'm doing that. Let's put this here. Cool. And now in this last section, we're going to duplicate this over and just change one thing about it. And what I'm thinking about changing is I'm going to have on these snare hits, which are on these third bars, because we're at a halftime beat, I'm going to do 64th notes ramping down like in a cool way. All right, so I'm going to click Command 1, get to my 1/64th bar divisions. I want my main beat here, that impulse, to be the loudest one, and everything else can be a lot quieter. So I'll have this go to about there. And now I want that to ramp down so that it sounds like it's de-escalating in energy, and I will have that be my change in these moments there. Sweet. Okay, cool. So now our hats have been iteratively sequenced and they have some velocity play in them. They have some different notations. They escalate in intensity and in energy at bar 21, which is cool. So let's move on to crashes. Now, there are a couple of things to know about crashes and about shakers. And there's plenty of things to know about hats. And we're going to talk about making these move and have a groove in the next lesson that I do. Right now, I just want to talk about iterative sequencing. So in keeping with this sort of escalating energy, you know what? I'm going to find some open hats first, and then we can talk crashes. So let me just call up a new MIDI track. I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to grab open hats. So hat open, perfect. That should work. You can see why the user library is useful once it's all organized for you. You can just effortlessly type something in and you have a bunch of samples that are ready to be played. Now, if I'm going to have an open hat within this first bar sequence and copy it over, I will find a good place for it. There are so many good places for hats. I'm going to press Command 2 in my grid and get to eighth notes. That's not a bad hat. Ooh, that one's dope. That's cool. All right, I'll keep that one. Now, if I'm going to duplicate that over and change one thing, what I feel like changing in this case is that. Sometimes changes can be silence. So I'm going to make that my whole bar. I didn't have anything there. Now, duplicate that over and change one thing. In this case, I will do that. That's my change. So now the open hat is just before the snare. Consolidate, duplicate it over, and change one thing. It's that easy, guys, and you just are people. You want to be doing this in kind of every sort of sequence that you make. And in this case, we can do that, and in this case, we can do, yeah, let's do it. We'll be predictable. All right, chill. Okay, so we have that now in our open hats. I'm going to take the extra couple seconds to name it, keep it color-coded, because I'm doing myself a favor in the future when I have to mix this down. And this is the process, you know? We're always trying to save those two very valuable limited commodities, mind space and time. So I am saving myself a ton of time later by doing this stuff now. And you will get that full mosaic picture once you start to finish a lot of tracks, because you'll see that when you get to the point where you have like 160 tracks or like 180 tracks, if they're not color-coded and if they're not named, it becomes paralyzing and it's a big mess. And you have to sort through things and listen to what it is, rename it, and that could literally take like an hour. It could take like 15 seconds for each thing. So we're saving ourselves hours later by doing this now. All right, let's play what we've got with this section. Oh, I'm also going to very quickly do a leveling. So for this case in leveling, I want my kick at -12, -13 will work for me. Let me just come up 1 decibel. I want my snare at -12 because in breakbeat music, unlike in house music, the kick and the snare are that back and forth punch that drives air from the speakers and makes bodies move. You want to think of your kick and your snare as the big fucking stacks, the pillars that are like, you want to be pushing bodies with air. And that's what a speaker is. That's what a speaker does. Fundamentally, a speaker is an instrument that can really only do 2 motions. And let's take a minute on this because this is an important concept that a lot of people overlook. A lot of producers aren't fully clear on the instrument that they're playing. We are not playing the computer. We're not playing Ableton. What you and I play is we play the speaker. And a speaker is fundamentally a horn. It can do 2 motions. It can go whoop, and it can push air, or it can go whoop, and it can pull air. And what that means is that when a speaker is not pushing or pulling air, it is flat. It's completely at rest. It's a completely flat line. You can see this in an audio track. For instance, if I go into our sample, this flat line here behind the sample is silence. But what is happening when the sampler is triggering this sample, this quick motion is going up and down, and it's starting at the top and it's going and it's slowing down out here so that the kick feels like a low instrument. And each of these up pulses, when it's above that flat line, is the speaker pushing air. And each of these down pulses, when the sample is below the line is the speaker pulling air. So for a speaker to make this sound, it's going boom, really, really fucking fast. So we have a speaker that is a horn that can either push air or pull air. That's it, positive or negative charges. We're physicists here. We are playing with electricity, and electricity targets our horn and tells our horn to push and pull air. But if you think about it, if we're breakbeat producers and we're pushing people with the kick and then we're pulling them back with the snare, boom, ka, boom, ka, like we're beating them up with sound waves. If they're going from left to right or even from up to down, that in music is called the meter. And the meter is the essence of dance. Boom, ka, boom, ka. We want to command the bodies listening to our music and tell them when and how to dance by pushing them with air. So it helps developing drums and subs and marrying things in phase when you start to think of it in this less musical and more physical sense of things. So I'm going to play. I want to get our volume levels mixed before I go any further. So I know that my kick should be at minus 12 decibels. You don't have to worry about these levels. Just trust me to know. I'm going to say them as I go along, and we're going to talk leveling really deep another time. I want my snare, because my kick and my snare are the two pillars of my beat. The boom, ka. I need them to be the same volume so that they're driving bodies with the same force in that back and forth motion, which is what we're constantly trying to capture. It's the push and the pull. So I can see down here coming out of the master channel, my snare is at minus 11.1. So it's a little bit too loud. So I'm going to go into here and I'm going to come down to minus 13. Boom, minus 12.1, cherry. Now, I know my hats need to be about 12 decibels quieter for a variety of reasons that we'll talk about in mixing. So just trust me to know. So those are way too fucking loud. So let's come down to minus 24, minus 22, so minus 26 decibels. And again, my eyes, this is the only place my eyes go in the session view. So if your eyes go there instinctually as well, you will be looking at what I'm looking at. So minus 24, that's a beautiful place for hats. Open hats should be maybe a little louder, kinds of depends. So we'll go to minus 23, minus 22. That's too loud. That's not allowed, hats. Minus 17. Too loud. All right, minus 22.5, I can live with that. Sweet, so let's listen to what we have in context. And now this has all been balanced to a much quieter volume threshold. So I'm going to put on a limiter and kick that up 12 decibels so that I can hear it at the volume 0. I'm also, again, this is all mixing stuff. Don't clog your thinking and your mind space up with it. We're focused on iterative sequencing today. But I am also going to map this to on and off so that I can press 1. See, I'm just hands off the keyboard, just pressing 1, and that limiter is going on and off. So 1, it's on. All right, now our volumes are at 0. Cool. All right, so we have a little bit of a beat. Now let's talk crashes. Crashes usually you want to alternate crashes, and there are certain good strategies that you can use crashes for, namely one big release of the crash on the downbeat. When you do that on the downbeat, you are telling your listener that there's a big, exciting transition. Something new is being introduced into the sound space. So let us find a crash that doesn't hurt our ears and that doesn't sound stupid in the context of this drum beat. I like that. That's fine. Nice and high pitch. Ooh, so loud, so loud. Sorry. So I'm going to press 1 so that I'm hearing the volume coming out of the master channel without that limiter there, which means I pressed 1, you guys. So that limiter is not on. So that, oops, let's just solo that, put that back to 0. Sound engineers will scold you and will constantly denigrate you for using faders. So don't use faders. If you must, and you will actually, use the utility plugin. Don't be doing a bunch of automation and transitions using panning and faders. It's super messy. We'll talk about that in mixing as well. So that is coming in at 9 decibels. So if I come down here to 24, now it's coming in at 21.3 decibels. I want this to be about 30 decibels minus 0. So come down 9. Now we have it at 30.3. That's a good place for a crash. Now I am going to use this whole sequence as my iterative sequencing, and I'm going to copy it over. And I'm going to change one thing. And in this case, what I feel like changing is the actual voice of the crash. We're going to use that one. So now I'm alternating crashes, and that was super easy to do. Now, another thing that we can do is let's get this stuff. Let's not get this to audio yet. All right, another thing that we can do is we can start getting, let's do some shakers, and then we can get the stuff to audio, and I can begin the next sort of stage of this because we have a beat. All right, so shakers are a really great way to put energy into a mix because they're higher frequency instruments. And remember, energy is measured by the intensity and the frequency of the higher frequency instruments. So shakers are a really great way to add a bunch of accelerated and intense energy in places that are kind of low energy. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to select this bar so we don't have those shakers poke their head out yet, because remember, we're trying to keep the cat in the bag and reveal the cat a little bit at a time. So if this is where our drop's going to come in, like so, I don't want those shakers to happen right away. I want to keep them for a reveal a little bit later on so that the complexity escalates here. And what we're going to do is let's go to our 16th note divisions. I find shakers work really well at 16th and 32 bar divisions. And that's kind of a stupid sounding shaker. Let me see if there's a better one. That's a shaker sound. Cool. So let's do that. And I am going to duplicate them all across so that my bars are taken. I'm trying to think, as a shaker, how would you be played if you were in the hands of a musician? Well, that is still on the downbeat. So I already have my main downbeat shaker, or my main downbeat position, this position 1 right here. That's being occupied by the impulse, by that extra volume impulse of this guy, of this hi-hat right here. So I don't know if I need the shaker to be as intense in that spot. So I think honestly, for this shaker being played by this imaginary musician, I think this is probably the beat that I want. This is probably the one that I want. So if that's the third, I'm going to actually lower all the volumes of all the guys around the third. And I don't know why my shakers are masculine. Forgive me. It's something that just happens. All right, cool. So I'm going to do that with my shakers. Now copy this across. I'm going to consolidate, and you guessed it, change one thing. Chill. So in this case, I've consolidated that over, and what I feel like doing is I want to, I'm going to ramp into the next sort of bar so that we're starting quiet and our shaker builds up in intensity so that our downbeat here with this crash is going to be a big reveal. So now I have some shakers. Oh, right, that's chill. Now again, because here, our hats are going crazy. They're coming in super hot. They're doing all kinds of fun things. I don't need the shakers. So if I were going to copy this over and change one thing, the thing that I would change is I'd kill it. I don't need that there. I've got an escalation in energy with my hi-hats. They're getting faster. They've escalated the energy, and I even have more open hi-hats here, which is another form of escalation because now there's more positions being occupied by the hi-hats. So if I copied that there, and I killed it, which was my big change, what I'm going to do for the next one, so I'm going to move it over. I'm going to turn it back on. That is the change of this iteration. That is the sequence that I am iterating. So in this case, it goes away. We lose a little bit of energy, but that energy is still held by the faster hi-hats. And then once we're familiarized with the faster hi-hats, right here, we know that they're going quickly. We're bringing the shakers back in to add a bunch of extra intensity. All right, guys, we have, keep doing that. All right, my friends, all right, beautiful people out there. We have all kinds of things happening. I am going to put a utility on this shaker, or I guess I can just come into the sampler and pan it a little bit. We're gonna go left with this for now, but in our next video, we're gonna talk all about making, getting the hats and the shakers moving and doing a lot of interesting stereo effects so that they're a lot more interesting than what we have. We're going to talk about movement, stereo spread, all kinds of really awesome stuff. So I don't want to start to get into that until next week, but just for a quick playback, let's do it. Cool, there we go. All right, everybody, I will see you next time. This was my very, very brief intro to iterative sequencing. Catch you next time.